On June 20th, 1965, a horrific collision on a Missouri highway did what bullets and brawls never could. It finally killed Ira Louvin. It was a violent end that perfectly mirrored his violent life. Ira was a musical genius who sang like an angel, but lived like a demon. A man so volatile that he once survived being shot 3 times in the chest by his own wife, only to vow revenge while bleeding on the floor. While his brother Charlie slept hundreds of miles away, the legendary blood harmony was severed forever. This is the story of the Louvin Brothers, the duo who conquered the world with songs about salvation while tearing each other apart in a real-life Cain and Abel tragedy. The story of the Louvin brothers begins in a place that barely existed on the map. It begins in the Hennegar community of Sand Mountain, Alabama, in the early 1920s. To call Sand Mountain a hard place is a polite understatement. Geographically, it is a plateau, a remnant of the Cumberland chain, isolated from the rest of the world by steep cliffs and poor roads. Culturally, in the 1920s, it was a fortress of isolationism. The people who clung to the side of that mountain were descendants of Scots-Irish immigrants, tough, suspicious people who viewed the valley below with distrust and the sky above with fear. This was a world of subsistence farming, where poverty wasn't a temporary economic condition. It was the atmosphere. It was the red dust that coated your lungs. It was the callus on your hand. It was the empty ache in your stomach that you learned to ignore by the age of 5. For the Loudermilk family, life was a binary equation. You worked the cotton or you starved. Colonel Monero Loudermilk, the patriarch of the clan, was a man carved from the Old Testament. He was not a father in the modern nurturing sense of the word. He was an authority figure, a terrifying presence who ruled his small patch of rocky earth with a strap in one hand and a Bible in the other. Monroe was a man of his time, beaten down by the crushing weight of the agrarian South, and he passed that beating down to his sons. He demanded absolute obedience. He viewed idleness as a sin and joy as a suspicion. But there was another presence in the house, a softer counterweight to Monroe's iron tyranny. Georgianne Loudermilk, their mother, was of the cryptic, mystical strain of Southern mountain women. Her family, the Wootons, were musical, but not in the way we think of music today. They didn't play for applause, they played for survival. They were steeped in the tradition of Sacred Harp singing, a stark, unaccompanied style of choral music, where the singers sit in a square and scream the glory of God at the top of their lungs. Sacred Harp is not pretty. It is not polished. It is raw, guttural, and intense. It is the sound of people who live hard lives, releasing their agony and their hope into the air. It was in this crucible of noise and faith that Ira and Charlie learned to breathe. They didn't learn music from a teacher. They absorbed it through their skin. They sat on the rough pine floors of local churches, watching the men and women sing with veins bulging in their necks, learning that music was a serious life and death business. From the very beginning, the dynamic between the brothers was set in stone, forged by the pressure of their father's brutality. Ira was the storm. Even as a child, he possessed a terrifying, vibrating energy. He was brilliant, quick-witted, and deeply sensitive, but that sensitivity had curdled into a defensive rage. He took the brunt of his father's beatings. When Monroe would lash out, Ira would stare back with eyes that burned with a defiance bordering on madness. He absorbed the violence and stored it, letting it ferment into a dark vintage that he would drink from for the rest of his life. Charlie was the anchor, younger, smaller, and quieter. He learned early on that the best way to survive in the Loudermilk house was to be invisible. He worshipped Ira. To Charlie, Ira wasn't just a brother. He was a superhero who could take a beating and still spit in the dust. Charlie became the peacemaker, the follower, the shadow. He developed a personality built around endurance. While Ira was the fire that threatened to burn the house down, Charlie was the wood that kept the structure standing. The defining moment of their lives, the moment the Louvin brothers truly began, did not happen on a stage. It happened in the cotton fields. To pass the agonizing hours of labor, picking bolls of cotton until their fingers were raw and bleeding, the boys would sing. They started with the old hymns their mother taught them. The old rugged cross, in the sweet by and by. At first, they were just two boys singing in a field. But then, something biological, almost chemical, occurred. They discovered the blood harmony. Scientists and musicologists have tried for decades to explain why siblings sing together differently than unrelated people. They talk about the shape of the nasal cavities, the length of the vocal cords, the shared cadence of speech learned at the dinner table. But on Sand Mountain, they didn't need science. They knew it was magic. When Ira took the high tenor part, soaring up into a falsetto that was sharp enough to cut glass, and Charlie took the lead melody in his warm, steady baritone, the two voices didn't just stack on top of each other. They merged. They created a third voice, a ghost voice that hummed in the overtones. It was a sound of piercing loneliness. It sounded like the wind howling through the cracks of a sharecropper's shack. It was beautiful, but it was also eerie. It was the sound of two boys crying out to a God they weren't sure was listening. However, music in the Loudermilk household was a contraband substance. Monero Loudermilk had a strict, non-negotiable taxonomy of sound. Hymns were for God. Everything else was for the devil. The secular music that was beginning to drift over the airwaves, the breakdown fiddle tunes, the mountain ballads, the early stirrings of what would become country music, was strictly forbidden. Monroe called it trash. He told his sons that if they sang that breakdown mess, they were inviting Satan into their hearts. But the devil, as it turned out, had better tunes. The boys became obsessed with the radio. In the 1930s, the battery-powered radio was the most revolutionary object in the American South. It was a portal. It allowed a boy stuck in the mud of Alabama to hear the Grand Ole Opry in Nashville, to hear the Monroe Brothers tearing up the airwaves with their lightning-fast mandolin and guitar. Ira Louvin didn't just listen, he studied. He dissected. He heard the way Bill Monroe attacked the mandolin, not strumming it like a polite parlor instrument, but whipping it like a mule. Ira wanted that power, but the Loudermilks were destitute. There was no money for shoes, let alone instruments. So, in a display of the genius that would later define his career, Ira built one. He didn't have wood or lacquer. He found an old gourd in the field. He scavenged some cedar for a neck. He used screen wire for strings. It was a monstrosity, a primitive object that barely held a tune. But to Ira, it was Excalibur. He played that gourd until his fingers bled. He played it until the calluses on his fingertips were hard as stone. He played with a desperation that frightened his mother. He wasn't playing for fun. He was playing to escape. He knew with the instinctive certainty of a trapped animal that music was the only ticket off Sand Mountain. The tension in the house reached a boiling point in the late 1930s. The boys were teenagers now. The Great Depression was dragging on, refusing to lift its boot from the neck of the South. The poverty was suffocating. But the boys were getting better. They were sneaking off to neighbors' houses to listen to the Grand Ole Opry. They were learning the secular songs, the Knoxville Girl, the murder ballads, the songs about trains and prisons. One afternoon, Monroe caught them. He heard them singing a song that wasn't in the hymnal, The violence that followed was routine, but the reaction was not. Ira, now nearly a man, stood up. He didn't strike his father. That was a death sentence. But he withdrew into a cold, hard silence. He began to plot. They started playing for anyone who would listen. They played at corn shuckings. They played at ice cream socials. They played on the porches of general stores. And they saw something that changed everything. They saw people stop. They saw hard men like their father who had never smiled in their lives, stop whittling and listen. They saw women wipe tears from their eyes with apron corners. They realized that their sound, that high, lonesome harmony, had power. It could manipulate emotions. It could command a room. For two boys who had been powerless their entire lives, this was an intoxicating drug. Their first true taste of the show business world, if you could call it that, came on a 4th of July in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Chattanooga was the big city, the metropolis compared to Hennigar. There was a contest for amateur musicians. The prize was small, barely enough to cover gas money, but the prestige was enormous. The boys, dressed in their Sunday best, stood on a makeshift stage. They looked terrified. They looked like what they were, hillbillies. But then they opened their mouths. They sang a duet, perhaps a Delmore Brothers song. The crowd, rowdy and drunk on holiday freedom, went silent. Ira's tenor cut through the humidity like a razor blade. Charlie's lead held him up. They won the contest. They held the small trophy like it was the Holy Grail. It was validation. It was proof that they weren't crazy. It was proof that they were better than the cotton field. But destiny is rarely a straight line. Just as they began to dream of leaving the farm, the world caught fire. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. The news trickled up to Sand Mountain slowly, but the draft notices arrived fast. The war was a cleaver that struck the Loudermilk family. Charlie, the younger, the steady one, was drafted. He was sent away to the Army Air Forces. For the first time in his life, he was stripped of his identity as Ira's brother. He was just Private Loudermilk. Ira, however, was left behind. He tried to enlist, desperate to prove his manhood, desperate to get away from Monroe. But the Army doctors took one look at his back, damaged from years of brutal farm labor, and rejected him. 4F, unfit for service. This rejection was a psychological catastrophe for Ira. In a culture where masculinity was defined by one's ability to fight and work, being told he was unfit was a castration. He was stuck on Sand Mountain with Monroe. He was stuck with the mules and the cotton. And crucially, he was stuck without Charlie. Without Charlie to balance him, without Charlie to absorb his rage and reflect his harmony, Ira began to unravel. The silence of the mountain became deafening. He needed a way to drown out the voice of his father and the voice in his own head that told him he was a failure. He found the solution in a bottle. Ira had always had a temper, but during the war years, he discovered alcohol. And unlike some men who grow sleepy or silly when they drink, alcohol turned Ira Louvin into a monster. It stripped away the thin veneer of his Christian upbringing and unleashed a torrent of paranoia and aggression. He drank to forget he was a failure. He drank to forget he was poor. He drank to forget that his blood harmony was fighting a war halfway around the world. By the time the war ended and the soldiers came home, the Loudermilk brothers were no longer boys. Charlie returned from the service a man, disciplined, worldly, and eager to restart their dream. He came back to Alabama expecting to pick up where they left off. What he found was a ruin. He found Ira, gaunt and wild-eyed, clutching a mandolin that he now played with a terrifying demonic proficiency. Ira had improved as a musician. His isolation had forced him to master the instrument, but he had deteriorated as a human being. The reunion was joyous, but it was shadowed. Charlie looked at his brother and saw the cracks in the porcelain. He saw the tremor in the hands that only steadied after a drink. But the sound was still there. They stood on the porch of the old farmhouse, the sun setting over the empire of dirt that had been their prison. Ira tuned his mandolin. Charlie strummed a borrowed guitar. They looked at each other, and for a moment the war, the whiskey, and the years of separation dissolved. They sang. The harmony locked in instantly. It was tighter, stronger, and more painful than before. The innocence was gone, replaced by a hard-earned experience that gave their voices a new jagged edge. Charlie knew in that moment that he had a choice. He could walk away, he could get a job at the post office, marry a nice girl, and live a safe, quiet life. He could leave Ira to his demons, or he could tether himself to this volatile genius and try to ride the storm all the way to the Grand Ole Opry. He looked at Ira, who was smiling, a rare, genuine smile that made him look like a boy again. Charlie took a breath. He chose the storm. "We're changing the name," Ira said, his voice trembling with a new ambition. "Loudermilk sounds like hillbillies. We need something smooth. Louvin, the Louvin Brothers." Charlie nodded. "The Louvin Brothers," he repeated. It sounded like a promise. It sounded like a threat. They packed their few belongings into a beat-up car held together by wire and prayer. They turned their backs on Sand Mountain, on the cotton, on Monroe's Strap. They pointed the car north toward Chattanooga, toward Knoxville, toward the radio towers that rose like steel cathedrals in the distance. They were armed with nothing but a mandolin, a guitar, and a harmony that could break your heart. But as they drove away, leaving the dust of their childhood behind, neither of them realized that they weren't escaping their past. They were packing it with them. Monroe was in the back seat. The poverty was in the trunk. And the devil was riding shotgun, tapping his foot to the rhythm of the tires, waiting for his turn to sing lead. As the red clay of Alabama faded in their rearview mirror, the brothers believed they were driving toward freedom. They thought that by putting physical distance between themselves and their father's farm, they could outrun the shadow of their upbringing. But geography is a deceptive cure for the soul. While the car carried them north toward the neon promises of the city, the baggage in the trunk, the trauma, the strict theology, and the thirst for chaos was rattling with every bump in the road. They had escaped the plow, but they were about to discover that the music business could be just as brutal as the cotton field and far less forgiving of a sinner. The road to glory is rarely a paved highway. For the Louvin brothers, it was a gravel path strewn with broken glass. When Ira and Charlie left Sand Mountain driving away from the shadow of their father and the suffocating silence of the cotton fields, they entered a world that was vibrating with a new kind of energy. Post-war America was waking up. The economy was booming, the cities were swelling, and the airwaves were becoming the new nervous system of the nation. But the Louvin brothers were not modern men. They were driving a beat-up car into the future while staring strictly at the rearview mirror. They landed first in Chattanooga, then Knoxville, entering the gladiatorial arena of live radio. In the late 1940s, being a country musician didn't mean playing concerts in stadiums. It meant waking up at 4 a.m. to drive to a radio station, drinking cold coffee, and singing live into a microphone while selling flour, fertilizer, or baby chicks to farmers eating breakfast. It was a grind. It was a blue-collar job that just happened to involve harmonies. They found work at WNOX in Knoxville, a legendary incubator of talent. Here, they joined the midday merry-go-round, a show hosted by a grocer politician named Cass Walker. Walker was a tyrant, a man who treated musicians like cattle, but he had the ear of the people. If you could survive Cass Walker, you could survive anything. And the Louvin brothers didn't just survive, they flourished. It was in these cramped, smoke-filled studios that the Louvin sound truly hardened. They learned to sing into a single RCA ribbon microphone. This technical limitation became their stylistic signature. To mix their voices, they couldn't turn a knob on a soundboard. They had to physically move their bodies. When Ira went for a high note, he would lean back. When Charlie dropped to the low register, he would lean in. It was a dance. It was a physical intimacy that translated into an auditory illusion. They weren't just singing together, they were breathing the same air, occupying the same space. But even as they conquered the local airwaves, Nashville, the Mecca, the Emerald City, remained a fortress with the gates locked. They traveled to the Grand Ole Opry for auditions, their hearts pounding in their chests, only to be met with polite, chilly rejections. The industry gatekeepers looked at them and saw dinosaurs. By 1950, country music was trying to put on a tuxedo. It was the era of Eddie Arnold, the Tennessee plowboy, who sang like a pop star. The rough edges were being sanded off. The banjo was being pushed to the back. The lyrics were becoming safer. The Louvin Brothers, with their intense gospel-drenched harmonies and their stark songs about death and damnation, were too hillbilly. They were too raw. They reminded the sophisticated Nashville executives of the poverty they were trying to forget. They were the embarrassing uncle at the wedding who talks too loudly about Jesus and corn liquor. Rejection is a corrosive acid, and it began to eat through the fragile metal of Ira Louvin's psyche. He took every no personally. He saw it not as a business decision, but as a judgment on his soul. And so the drinking intensified. On stage, Ira was a figure of mesmerizing intensity. He played the mandolin, not like a folk instrument, but like a weapon. His chop, the rhythmic percussive stroke on the offbeat, was so loud and so driving that it sounded like a snare drum. He was the engine of the band. But off stage, the engine was overheating. Ira was a mean drunk. There is no romantic way to phrase it. Alcohol stripped away his inhibitions and unleashed a torrent of paranoia and violence. He would smash his mandolins in fits of rage. He was a perfectionist who heard sounds in his head that no human hand could play, and when he failed to reach them, he wanted to destroy the world. Charlie, the eternal pragmatist, became the cleanup crew. He glued the mandolins back together. He apologized to the station managers. He drove the car while Ira passed out in the back seat, muttering curses at invisible enemies. Their salvation came in the form of a man named Fred Rose. Rose was a giant of the industry, a sophisticated songwriter from the North who had partnered with Roy Acuff to form Acuff Rose, the most powerful publishing house in Nashville. Rose was a genius who had polished Hank Williams into a diamond. He saw something in the Louvin brothers that the others missed. He didn't see hillbillies, he saw authenticity. He saw the ancient, tragic power of the Greek chorus in Two Boys from Alabama. Rose became their champion. He secured them a contract with Capitol Records in 1952, pairing them with producer Ken Nelson. Nelson, to his eternal credit, understood that the Louvin brothers didn't need producing. They didn't need string sections or background choirs. They just needed the tape to roll. "I don't know what you're doing," Nelson famously told them, "but keep doing it." And what they did was unleash a string of recordings that stand as the high water mark of the duet style. They recorded The Great Atomic Power, a song that took the terrified zeitgeist of the Cold War, the fear of the bomb, and turned it into a fundamentalist sermon. Are you ready for that great atomic power? Will you rise and meet your Savior in the air? While other artists were singing about cheating hearts and honky-tonk angels, Ira Louvin was singing about the mushroom cloud as the right hand of God. Then came The Christian Life. It is a song of simple, devastating beauty. I won't lose a friend by trying to help a friend. I won't lose a friend by trying to be true. It describes the joy of living a clean, holy existence. And here lies the central, agonizing paradox of the Louvin Brothers. The man writing and singing these lyrics with angelic conviction was, at that very moment, living a life of utter debauchery. Ira Louvin was a walking contradiction. He was a man who read the Bible backstage and then went to a bar to pick a fight. He would weep over a hymn and then go home and terrorize his wife. This wasn't hypocrisy in the simple sense. It was schizophrenia of the soul. Ira believed every word he wrote. He desperately wanted the Christian life. He wanted the peace he sang about, but he was possessed by a compulsion he couldn't control. He was a man clawing at the gates of heaven with hands stained by the mud of hell. This tension is what makes their music vibrate with such power. When you hear Ira sing When I Stop Dreaming, perhaps their greatest masterpiece, you aren't hearing a pop song. You are hearing a confession. I can't change the way I feel. I'd be lying if I said I didn't love you. The high tenor part, sung by Ira, is so desperate, so pleading, that it transcends the genre of country music and becomes pure human suffering captured on magnetic tape. By the mid-1950s, they were stars. They had joined the Grand Ole Opry, finally achieving the dream that had seemed impossible on Sand Mountain. They were selling records. They were touring the country. They were the kings of the duet. But as their professional star reached its zenith, Ira's personal life was descending into a violent nadir. He was on his third marriage, this time to a woman named Faye. Their relationship was a war zone. It was Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, played out in a trailer park with loaded weapons. They drank together, they fought together, and the violence was mutual. The climax of this domestic horror show occurred one night in a haze of alcohol and rage. An argument escalated. Faye, pushed to the breaking point, grabbed a pistol. She didn't threaten, she fired. She shot Ira multiple times with bullets tearing into his chest and shattering his hand, the hand that played the mandolin. Most men would have died. Ira Louvin did not die. He looked down at the blood pouring from his chest, looked at his wife, and in a moment that sounds like fiction, but is documented fact, he said with cold, terrifying calm, "If you don't kill me, I'm going to kill you." He didn't kill her, and he didn't die. The police arrived, the ambulance screamed into the night, and the scandal rippled through Nashville. Did you hear? Ira Louvin got shot by his wife. In the conservative, image-conscious world of the 1950s Opry, this was a disaster. But Ira was indestructible. He survived the surgery, he survived the scandal, and most miraculously, he survived the injury to his hand. Doctors said he might never play again. Ira picked up the mandolin with his hand still bandaged, wincing in agony, and relearned how to play. He modified his technique, adjusting his grip to accommodate the damaged nerves. If anything, his playing became more ferocious. He was playing through pain, literally. Every chop of the mandolin was a triumph over the bullet. Charlie watched all of this with a growing sense of dread. He was the sensible one, the man who showed up on time, the man who saved his money. He was trapped in a golden cage with a tiger. He couldn't leave. The act was too successful. The money was too good, and the blood bond was too strong. But he was exhausted. He was developing a stomach ulcer from the sheer stress of managing Ira. He knew that every time the phone rang late at night, it could be the police or the hospital or the morgue. Yet amidst the chaos, the artistic output remained pristine. In fact, it was getting darker and more profound. They began to dig into the old tragic songs, the murder ballads. They recorded Knoxville Girl, a song about a man who brutally murders a young woman and throws her in the river. It is a song of horrific violence, but the Louvins sang it with a sweetness that is almost psychopathic. They sang it like a lullaby. This juxtaposition, the horror of the lyrics against the beauty of the harmony, created a sense of unease that no other artist could replicate. They were showing the audience that evil doesn't always sound like a growl. Sometimes it sounds like an angel. The year was 1956. Rock and roll had just detonated. A young truck driver named Elvis Presley, who had grown up listening to the Louvin Brothers, who idolized them, who used to stand in the wings of the Opry just to watch them, was changing the world. The youth of America were trading their fiddles for electric guitars. The old-time sound of the Louvin was suddenly in danger of becoming a museum piece. But Ira Louvin was not a man to bend to trends. He hated rock and roll. He saw it as the ultimate corruption, a dilution of the pure, white-hot truth of country music. He famously dismissed Elvis with a racial slur, calling him a white man trying to sound black, and labeled the new sound as trash. While other country stars tried to adapt, recording rockabilly tracks to stay relevant, Ira dug his heels in. He wanted to go further back. He wanted to go deeper into the tradition. He began to conceive of a project that would be his magnum opus. It wouldn't be a collection of love songs. It wouldn't be a commercial pivot. It would be a concept album before the term existed. It would be a theological statement. Ira had a vision. He wanted to show the world the devil. Not a cartoon devil, not a metaphorical devil, but the literal breathing adversary that he fought every single night in the bottom of a whiskey bottle. He started sketching a cover art design on the back of a napkin. He envisioned a hellscape. He envisioned fire. He envisioned judgment. He called the album Satan is Real. The creation of this album would become the stuff of legend. It was 1959. The Louvin brothers were walking a tightrope over an abyss. On one side was the changing music industry that wanted to discard them. On the other side was Ira's disintegrating personal life. And right in the middle, they decided to build a fire. They went to a rock quarry in Nashville to shoot the cover. Ira directed the proceedings with the mania of a film director. He ordered tires to be soaked in kerosene and set ablaze to create the fires of hell. The heat was intense. The smoke was choking. Standing behind them was a massive 12-foot-tall plywood cutout of Satan that Ira had helped design. It was grotesque with crossed eyes and a leering red face. To the modern eye, it looks kitschy. But to Ira, standing there in his white suit, sweat pouring down his face, inhaling the black smoke of burning rubber, it was dead serious. He was standing in the fire. He was looking at the devil, and he was dragging Charlie right in there with him. The recording sessions that followed were an exorcism. They sang The River of Jordan, There's a Higher Power, and the title track, Satan is Real. In the title track, an elderly man tells a congregation about the reality of the devil. It is chilling. It is the sound of a man who knows his enemy intimately. Satan is Real was released to a confused world. It wasn't a hit in the traditional sense. It was too intense, too weird, too archaic, but it was a masterpiece. It was the purest distillation of the Southern Gothic aesthetic ever captured. It was the sound of the Louvin brothers building a cathedral out of their own wreckage, but a cathedral built on a fault line cannot stand. As the 1960s dawned, the cracks in the foundation widened into chasms. Ira's drinking was no longer just a problem. It was a career ender. He became abusive to promoters. He cursed at audiences. He showed up too drunk to play. The countrypolitan producers at the Opry were embarrassed by them. The smooth, lush sound of Patsy Cline and Jim Reeves was taking over. The Louvin Brothers, with their fire and brimstone mandolin and their terrifying songs, looked like ghosts from a forgotten era. Charlie Louvin sat in the passenger seat of the car, watching the miles roll by, watching his brother's hands shake on the steering wheel, and he began to do the math. He calculated the debt. He calculated the danger. He looked at Ira, the man he loved more than anyone on earth, the man whose voice was the only sound that made sense to him, and he realized a terrible truth. The harmony was killing them. And somewhere in the distance, down the long, dark timeline of the future, a drunk driver in Missouri was getting into his car, unknowingly starting the final countdown. That countdown would tick away not in seconds, but in years. Years of deteriorating performances, shattered instruments, and a growing, suffocating silence between the two men. The car that had once been their chariot of escape had transformed into a mobile prison cell. With every mile marker they passed, the incredible tension that fueled their music began to curdle into a toxic resentment. The bond of blood was strong, but even steel snaps under enough pressure. And as the 1960s approached, the Louvin brothers were careening toward a cliff edge that everyone saw coming, except perhaps for Ira himself. The end of the world does not always come with a bang. Sometimes it comes with the quiet click of a latch closing on an instrument case. By 1963, the silence between Ira and Charlie Louvin had become louder than the music. The car rides, once filled with the planning of tours and the rehearsing of harmonies, were now suffocating endurance tests. They were two men trapped in a rolling steel cage speeding down the American highway, bound together by a contract and a bloodline, but separated by an ocean of resentment. The breaking point was not a single cinematic explosion. It was the accumulation of 1,000 small cuts. It was the nights Charlie spent pacing in motel parking lots, waiting for Ira to stumble out of a bar. It was the apologies Charlie had to mutter to venue owners when Ira insulted their wives or smashed his mandolin against the microphone stand because a string had slipped out of tune. It was the financial terror of watching their bookings dry up because promoters simply refused to hire that drunk genius and his brother. Charlie Louvin was a man of simple, sturdy virtues. He was a husband. He was a father. He wanted to pay his mortgage. He wanted to put food on the table. Ira Louvin was a man of chaotic, destructive impulses who seemed determined to burn the table, the house, and the mortgage to the ground, just to see the flames. The friction between Charlie's desire for stability and Ira's addiction to chaos had worn the brake pads down to nothing. In August of 1963, the friction finally sparked a fire that burned the bridge. After a particularly disastrous run of shows where Ira was incoherent and belligerent, Charlie made the decision that would define the rest of his life. He didn't scream. He didn't fight. He simply did the math. He realized that if he stayed with Ira, he would go down with the ship. And unlike Ira, Charlie had a family who needed him to stay afloat. "I'm done, Ira," Charlie said. It was a sentence that shattered 20 years of history. Ira stared at him. For a moment, the rage that usually fueled him flickered out, replaced by a look of genuine confusion. To Ira, the Louvin brothers were a single organism. You couldn't cut it in half and expect it to live. "You can't quit," Ira said, his voice trembling with a mixture of arrogance and panic. "You're nothing without me. I write the songs, I play the mandolin. You just stand there." It was a cruel thing to say, a lash of the whip designed to bring Charlie back into submission. But this time, the whip didn't sting. It just confirmed the decision. Charlie packed his bag. He walked out the door. He left the blood harmony behind. The divorce of the Louvin brothers was an earthquake in the country music world, though the tremors were felt mostly by the purists. To the general public, distracted by the British invasion and the glossy Nashville sound. It was just another hillbilly act fading away. But for Charlie and Ira, it was an amputation. For the first time in his life, Charlie Louvin stood on a stage alone. The experience was terrifying. He later described it as feeling naked. For 2 decades, he had stood to Ira's right. He had leaned into the microphone, waiting for Ira's tenor to lift his voice up. Now he leaned in, and there was nothing but air. He had to sing the lead. He had to sing the chorus. He had to talk to the crowd. He had to be the whole show. The industry bet against him. Everyone knew Ira was the genius. Ira was the virtuoso. Charlie was just the other one. But Charlie possessed something Ira lacked: discipline. He signed a solo deal with Capitol Records. He showed up to the studio sober. He listened to the producers. And in 1964, he released I Don't Love You Anymore. The song was a hit. It climbed the charts. It was a polished, radio-friendly country song, lacking the gothic intensity of the Louvin Brothers' work. But it was successful. It proved to Nashville, and more importantly to Charlie himself, that he could survive on his own. He wasn't just a shadow. He was a man. For Ira, however, the post-breakup reality was a descent into a darker circle of hell. Ira took Charlie's departure as a personal betrayal of biblical proportions. He felt abandoned. He felt like Abel had walked away and left Cain to rot in the field. Without Charlie to act as his anchor, his designated driver and his buffer against the world, Ira spun out of control. He tried to launch a solo career. He recorded an album titled The Unforgettable Ira Louvin. The irony was painful. The music was largely forgettable. Without Charlie's smooth, steady baritone to ground him, Ira's voice sounded thin and frantic. The mandolin playing was still brilliant, but it felt manic, like a bird throwing itself against a window pane. His personal life became a blur of warrants and whiskey. He was arrested for driving under the influence multiple times. There were nights he spent in county jails, his fingers twitching on the concrete floor, dreaming of melodies he couldn't play. He lost his recording contract with Capitol. The phone stopped ringing. The genius of the mandolin was becoming a tragic punchline in Nashville bars. But the human spirit is resilient, and even a man as tortured as Ira Louvin has moments of clarity. By 1965, there were signs of a thaw. Ira had met a woman named Florence. She was different from his previous wives. She was tough, but she wasn't volatile. She didn't shoot him. She steadied him. Under Florence's influence, Ira was trying to sober up. It wasn't a clean recovery. The old demons were still there, but for the first time in years, he was at least reaching for the light. He started performing with Florence. They sang gospel songs. It wasn't the Louvin Brothers, but it was music. It was a lifeline. And then the impossible happened. The phone rang at Charlie's house. It was Ira. The conversation was tentative, awkward, loaded with the weight of unsaid apologies. But they talked. They didn't scream. They talked about their mother. They talked about the old days on Sand Mountain. And inevitably, they talked about the music. "We should do it again, Charlie," Ira said. "Just a few shows. For the fans." Charlie hesitated. The scars were still fresh. He remembered the humiliation, the fear, the chaos, but he also remembered the sound. He remembered the feeling of their voices locking together, that vibration in his chest that told him he was exactly where God intended him to be. You can divorce a wife, you can quit a job, but you cannot resign from your own blood. "Maybe," Charlie said. "Let's see, Ira, let's see." It was a glimmer of hope, a fragile, tentative promise of a reunion. The industry heard the whispers. A Louvin Brothers reunion tour in 1965? It would have been triumphant. They could have reclaimed their throne. They could have shown the world that the old sound never died. But history is not written by hope. It is written by physics and fate. June 1965. Ira and Florence were touring in the Midwest. They were playing small venues, high school auditoriums, and county fairs. It was a humbling step down from the Grand Ole Opry, but Ira seemed content. He was playing well. He was drinking less. On his better nights, he almost looked like the man he had always wanted to be. On the night of June 19th, they played a show in Jefferson City, Missouri. The crowd was small but appreciative. Ira played The Christian Life and Knoxville Girl. He sang with clarity. He looked healthy. After the show, they packed up their instruments. Ira put his beloved mandolin in its case, the instrument that was an extension of his own body. They decided to drive home to Alabama. It was a long drive, but they wanted to get back. They wanted to sleep in their own bed. It was Father's Day weekend. At the same time, in a different part of Missouri, another man was getting into his car. We know very little about him other than the fact that he had been drinking. He was not a famous musician. He was not a tortured genius. He was just a man who made a fatal decision to get behind the wheel while intoxicated. Fate is often depicted as a grand weaver, but sometimes it is just a drunk driver on a two-lane highway. Ira turned onto Highway 70. It was early morning, June 20th. The sun hadn't risen yet. The road was a ribbon of gray in the darkness. The air was humid. Ira was likely tired, the adrenaline of the show fading into the rhythmic hum of the tires. Florence was beside him, perhaps sleeping. They were approaching a section of the road near Williamsburg. It was a blind curve or a hill. The details are lost to the geography of the past. What matters is the geometry of the collision. The other car drifted. It crossed the center line. There was no time to react, no time to swerve, no time to pray, no time to sing one last note. The impact was catastrophic. The vehicles collided head-on at highway speeds. The physics of 1965 automobiles, heavy steel, no airbags, rigid steering columns, turned the crash into a death sentence. Ira Louvin, the man who had survived poverty, abuse, alcoholism, and 3 gunshots to the chest, did not survive this. He was killed instantly. Florence was killed instantly. The driver of the other car was killed instantly. In a split second, the music stopped. The mandolin in the back seat was thrown against the casing, perhaps snapping a string. A final discordant note that no one heard. The news traveled slowly in 1965. There were no cell phones, no internet. The police had to identify the bodies. They found Ira's identification. They realized who he was. The calls began to go out. Charlie Louvin was at home. When the phone rang, the sound must have cut through the house like a siren. He picked it up. He heard the voice on the other end. We can only imagine the sensation of the floor dropping out from under him. The maybe of the reunion evaporated. The hope of reconciliation was extinguished. The brother he had loved, hated, protected, and fled from was gone. Charlie didn't just lose a brother. He lost his mirror. He lost the only other person on earth who remembered the smell of the dirt on Sand Mountain, the sting of their father's belt, and the exact precise frequency of the harmony they had created. He was now, truly and finally, a solo act. The funeral was held in Nashville. It was a somber affair. The country music community, which had shunned Ira in his final years, turned out to mourn him. They eulogized his genius. They ignored the drunken rages and spoke of the angel in his throat. Roy Acuff was there. Bill Monroe was there. They looked at the casket and saw the end of an era. Charlie stood by the grave. He looked at the hole in the ground that would swallow half of his soul. He must have thought about the irony. Ira had spent his life singing about death, singing about it with a longing, almost a lust. He sang, "I'll live with God somewhere, no more to die." He sang, "Make him a soldier in the army of the Lord." Now the soldier was dead. The war was over. But for Charlie, the battle was just entering a new phase, the phase of memory, the phase of haunting. He had to go back out on the road. He had contracts to fulfill. He had to stand on stage and sing the songs they had made famous. How do you sing "When I Stop Dreaming Alone"? How do you sing "You Don't Believe Me, I'm Sure You Don't Believe Me" without the tenor voice cutting in to argue the point? Charlie Louvin was about to find out. He was about to spend the next 45 years finding out. He would step onto the stage, look at the empty space to his right, and he would have to sing loud enough for both of them. And so, the duet ended not with a final bow, but with a funeral service. The physical partnership was severed by the brutal finality of twisted metal on a Missouri highway. Yet, as the mourners dispersed and the industry prepared to write the epitaph of the Louvin Brothers, a new, stranger reality began to set in for the man left behind. Death ends a life, but it does not end a relationship. For Charlie, the sudden silence of his brother's voice was not an ending, but the beginning of a long, haunting conversation with a ghost that would refuse to leave the stage. The hardest thing about being a survivor is not the grief, it is the silence. For Charlie Louvin, the silence that descended after June 1965 was deafening. He was 37 years old, a widower of the soul, standing in the ruins of the only musical identity he had ever known. The industry expected him to fade away. In the brutal calculus of Nashville, a duet partner without his other half is like a pair of scissors with one blade, useless, destined for the drawer of forgotten things. But Charlie Louvin was made of the same stubborn Alabama clay as his brother. He didn't quit. He didn't retire to Sand Mountain to count his memories. He did the only thing he knew how to do. He put on his suit, tuned his guitar, and walked out onto the stage. His first performances after Ira's death were exercises in public agony. He would stand at the microphone, and out of pure muscle memory, he would lean to his right, leaving room for a shoulder that was no longer there. He would start a song like, "I Don't Believe You've Met My Baby." And when he reached the chorus, the moment where the heavens were supposed to open up with that piercing tenor harmony, there was only air. He had to learn to sing for two. He had to fill the negative space. He hired other tenor singers to tour with him. Good men, professional men, but they were just placeholders. They hit the notes, but they didn't bleed them. They didn't have the blood. Charlie knew it, and the audience knew it. Yet, there was a quiet nobility in his persistence. He wasn't trying to replace Ira. He was paying rent on the legacy. He became the custodian of the museum, polishing the glass cases, ensuring the world didn't forget the artifacts inside. The 1970s and 80s were long, lean years. Country music changed, mutated, and evolved. The outlaw movement came and went. The urban cowboy craze swept the nation. Through it all, Charlie Louvin kept the bus moving. He played the county fairs, the VFW halls, the small festivals. He became a legacy act, a polite term for a living fossil. He was the man who used to be famous. But underground, something strange was happening. The Louvin brothers were being discovered by the unlikeliest of tribes, the hippies, the punks, and the rock stars. It started with Graham Parsons, the beautiful doomed prince of cosmic American music. Parsons, a wealthy Harvard dropout with a soul full of kerosene, worshipped the Louvin brothers. He saw past the suits and the Bible verses. He saw the pain. He saw the punk rock attitude of Ira Louvin before punk rock even existed. When Parsons joined the Byrds, he forced them to record The Christian Life, not as a joke, but as a sincere tribute. Suddenly, long-haired kids in San Francisco were listening to the songs of Sand Mountain fundamentalists. Then came Emmylou Harris. In 1975, she recorded If I Could Only Win Your Love, turning a Louvin Brothers deep cut into a chart-topping hit. She spoke of them with the reverence usually reserved for saints. She didn't talk about them as hillbillies. She talked about them as artists of the highest order. This rediscovery was the ultimate irony. Ira Louvin had hated rock and roll. He had despised the counterculture, and yet it was the rockers and the rebels who resurrected him. They saw the Satan is Real album cover not as a sermon, but as a piece of Andy Warhol-level pop art. They saw Ira's mandolin smashing and drunk driving not as a sin, but as the archetype of the tortured rock god. Ira Louvin became cool. Charlie watched this revival with a bemused smile. He didn't fully understand why kids with nose rings and tattoos wanted to talk to him about the great atomic power, but he welcomed them. He became the grandfather of the alt-country movement. He collaborated with bands like Cake and Cheap Trick. He stood on stage at rock festivals, a white-haired man in a modest suit, and blew the roof off with the old songs. He lived long enough to see the full circle. In 2003, a tribute album titled Livin' Lovin' Losin' Songs of the Louvin Brothers was released. It featured James Taylor, Johnny Cash, Dolly Parton, and Merle Haggard covering their songs. It won a Grammy Award. Charlie Louvin walked up to the podium to accept it. He held the golden gramophone, and for a moment the ghost was right there beside him. The industry that had once called them trash was now bowing at the altar. But time is the one adversary you cannot outsing. In 2010, Charlie was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. It was a death sentence, swift and brutal, but Charlie Louvin did not go gently. He approached his death with the same pragmatic stoicism with which he had approached Ira's life. He booked tours. He recorded a final album, appropriately titled The Battles Rage On. He gave interviews until his voice was a whisper. He told the old stories one last time, the story of the gourd mandolin, the story of the cotton fields, the story of the bullet holes. He never spoke of Ira with bitterness. The hate had long since evaporated, burned away by the decades of missing him. He spoke of Ira with a profound aching love. "I never heard a voice I liked better," he would say, "and I never will." On January 26, 2011, Charlie Louvin died at his home in Wartrace, Tennessee. He was 83 years old. The news didn't carry the shock value of Ira's violent end, but it carried a deep, resonant sadness. It was the closing of the book. The last voice of the harmony was gone. So what is the legacy of the Louvin brothers? Why does this story, a story of two brothers from a forgotten corner of Alabama, still matter? It matters because it is the ultimate American parable of the cost of art. We live in a culture that loves the myth of the tortured artist, but we often sanitize the torture. We want the songs without the scars. The Louvin brothers refuse to let us off that hook. They show us that the most beautiful sounds often come from the ugliest places. They show us that you can love God and be possessed by the devil at the exact same time. Their music is a testament to the power of blood. Blood harmony is more than a biological quirk. It is a metaphor for the human connection. We are all looking for that other voice that blends perfectly with ours, that frequency that makes us feel whole. Ira and Charlie found it, and then they lost it. And the tragedy of that loss is captured in every single recording they left behind. If you listen to When I Stop Dreaming Today, really listen to it, you can hear the ghost. You hear the crackle of the needle, the hum of the vacuum tubes, and then those two voices, Charlie low and steady, Ira high and desperate. When I stop dreaming, that's when I'll stop loving you. They aren't just singing a country song. They are singing about a bond that transcends death. They are proving, note by note, that while the singers may die, The song, if it is true, if it is honest, if it is blood, lives forever. Somewhere beyond the static of the radio, beyond the wreckage of the highway and beyond the silence of the grave, the concert is finally starting. The anger is gone. The whiskey bottle is empty. The car crash is a distant memory. There is just the light and the music. Charlie takes a breath. Ira picks up the mandolin, and finally, for the first time in 50 years, the harmony is complete.